The Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. Well, my guest today has written a brand new book, and it is called Can Fasting Save Your Life? It comes out Tuesday. Please, please buy it now. It really helps authors. If you buy the books in advance, that helps them become a New York Times bestseller. It's available anywhere fine books are sold, such as Barnes & Noble or other booksellers. Of course, you can get it on Amazon, but if you get it on the TrueNorth website for the same price, including shipping, you can get it signed personally by Dr. Alan Goldhamer. Please welcome him to the show. Hi, Dr. Goldhamer. Congratulations on the new book.
Thank you, AJ. We're very excited to have it completed finally.
It's been a long time coming, hasn't it?
It has. We've been working on this book for a long time. We started working on it when Dr. Myers joined us about 10 years ago, and we began to publish articles in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. We now have 22 articles and case reports that have actually been published. And this book allowed us to take all of that information, synthesize it. And one of the strengths that Dr. Myers has is she can take very complicated technical issues, but make them really understandable. And so the book is a book that is useful for a patient, but also for that patient's doctor, because everything that a person needs to know to understand fasting in order to be able to implement it safely is actually in the book. It's also designed to help convince people, including patients' physicians, that fasting is not really crazy, that it's been well documented, that it can be done safely and effectively. And so I feel like we really accomplished that in large part because Dr. Myers really is able to bridge the gap between scientists and normal person.
That is fantastic. You know, I had the privilege of reading it almost a year ago when I was at Rancho La Puerta with your wife, Dr. Jennifer Morano. So I got to read an advanced copy, and I loved it then. And maybe you could talk a little bit about what people will get from reading this book.
Well, one thing, they'll understand kind of the history of fasting. They'll understand the basic physiology that's understood now. In other words, what changes in the body take place, why somebody would consider fasting, and how fasting is particularly applicable not just to sick people, but also to healthy people. One of the studies that we did recently looked at what happens to people metabolically and physiologically when they're healthy. And as you know, AJ, it's really hard to find healthy people nowadays. Only about 12% of the people are metabolically healthy, and only less than 3% of people actually adopt health-promoting habits and maintain normal body weight. So finding healthy people will turn out to be quite a challenge. In fact, we ultimately, in order to get enough people for the study, we had to start recruiting staff members. So a lot of the people actually in the study happen to be people that work, live, and eat at TrueNorth Health Center, because that's where we were able to find a nice pool of healthy people. But in this study, we learned that as much benefit as sick people can get from fasting, perhaps some of the biggest changes of all proportionally occurred in healthy people. And so healthy people actually, in some ways, proportionally may get even more benefit than sick people. Ultimately, we may find that fasting to help people stay healthy may be as valuable as any other aspect of fasting.
But is it not harder to get people that are already healthy to fast? Because, I mean, what is their incentive? Just to live longer, live better?
Well, I don't know, living longer certainly is a good thing, but I think more importantly than living longer is actually improving healthy life expectancy, living better. People know that a large amount of determining how long you're going to live is luck. In other words, luck and genetics. But how well you're going to live in the time you have, that's largely determined by diet and lifestyle. So the day you're born, you have a maximum life potential, and you may not be able to lengthen that, but you can shorten it. But the bigger issue is debility. The average person may spend 10 or 20 years of debility in their life, whereas people that live healthily, they still die, but they tend to live until they die. So they usually have a good life and a good death where they go to sleep and don't wake up, rather than spend years or decades debilitated waiting for other people to take care of them.
Is fasting a cure?
No. Fasting, like healthful living, is not a cure, it's a management strategy. For example, you can't cure obesity. You can lose the weight and keep it off if you live healthy, but if you go back to eating greasy, fatty, processed crap, you're going to get fat again. In fact, it's really interesting how difficult it is. Do you know it's probably harder for people to lose weight and keep it off, statistically speaking, than it is to solve alcoholism or heroin addiction? If you
That's
think about the
hard to
data, if
believe.
you're an
Wow.
alcoholic and you go to inpatient care for 30 days and spend $40,000 and then go to 90 visits in 90 days to a 12-step program and you have family support, 83% of those people will be drinking within a year. So if you're a heroin addict and you go to inpatient care, even if it's court mandated, 90% will be using heroin within a year. So 90% failure rate. If you ask somebody to lose 5% of their body weight and keep it off for 1 year, the failure rate's 95%. So actually have a higher success rate in treating drug addiction than alcoholism. And I think it's because we lie to people that are overweight. And we don't lie to people that are alcoholics or drug addicts. If you're an alcoholic or drug addict, we tell you the truth. You don't do well with this chemical that's fooling your brain and causing excess dopamine stimulation. So you have to not drink. We don't tell alcoholics, well, just drink on the weekend or to have beer and wine and you won't be a drunk anymore. We tell them you got to stop drinking. Heroin addicts, we don't say, well, cut it down a little bit, only use it occasionally, you'll be okay, just special occasions. We tell them the truth. You've got to stop using drugs to be successful. But what we do is we tell overweight people they should eat less or to put their food on a smaller plate or to put the fork down between each bite and chew more, and then they won't be overweight anymore. Instead of telling them the truth, that there's chemicals in the food that's fooling the satiety mechanism in their brain, causing excess dopamine stimulation, and that they're an addict. And they need to stop eating the salt, oil, and sugar that are the chemicals that are fooling their brain. I thought it was interesting, cocaine is that fine white powder that does so much damage, and sugar is a fine white powder that does so much damage, and so is salt. I just think in general, we ought to be careful about fine white powders.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just tell you your stats right now, because we really want people to buy the book. And if they're going to get it, please get it this week, because you're right now, you're #1 in high blood pressure books, #2 in pathology, clinical and chemistry books, and #19 in healing. And your rating overall on Amazon in the top 100 is fantastic. But we need more, because if a book like this could be a New York Times bestseller, imagine the amount of people that could be helped.
Yeah, that would be good. It would also piss a lot of people off, which might be entertaining too. So that would be good.
You're so funny. Well, you mentioned that it's not a cure. And so are there people that come to the TrueNorth Health Center, or that have come, or that would like to come, thinking that they can just fast, get rid of their condition, and then go back to whatever they were doing that created it in the first place?
Well, that's what everybody wants to believe, that they can do something and then they don't have to actually make diet and lifestyle changes. Unfortunately, that's not real. The truth is that fasting can be very helpful as a tool, but it's diet, sleep, and exercise that are going to determine how well and how long and how well you live. So diet, we advocate a whole plant food diet that's salt, oil, and sugar-free. That's very radical. And, many people would argue that it's so difficult that most people won't be able to do that. And I wouldn't necessarily disagree with them. It is very difficult. But just like it's really difficult to quit drinking and it's really difficult to quit smoking, quitting is actually what works. And going on a whole plant food SOS-free diet works. People lose weight, they regain their health. And granted, there can be side effects like, you may become a bit of a social outcast in some areas. Just like when people quit drinking, sometimes they have to get some new friends because some of their old friends won't tolerate them no longer being a drunk. Sometimes when people lose weight, their old friends are not comfortable with them being thinner and healthier, and they treat them cruelly, and they have to sometimes cultivate new friends. So I'm not saying it's easy. I acknowledge it's really difficult. But if you want to lose weight, regain your health, and be able to maintain that long term, this is one of the strategies that we found actually works for people.
Yeah. So many of the people in the plant-based world, many of the doctors agree about being whole food plant-based or exclusively vegan and oil-free, but you go an extra step that some of the doctors may think is a little bit unnecessary or extreme, the sugar and salt. How does that play a role in someone's healing or management of disease?
Well, sugar is a real problem, AJ. In fact, people are eating 100 to 150 pounds of this chemical a year because it's so appealing, but it's empty calories. It causes insulin disruption where the insulin levels go high, it drives the sugar low, your brain thinks you're starving. Now you talk about binging and craving, and a lot of the physiological components to eating disorders are driven by these biochemical changes driven by sugar and refined carbohydrates. There's probably no single factor that's, more insidious in terms of weight loss than the use of refined carbohydrates. So, I don't think it's that controversial, the idea that we shouldn't be eating, these types of refined carbohydrates. Fat, I think most people recognize that, like Dr. McDougall was fond of saying, the fat you eat is the fat you wear. And fat is a highly fractionated food that makes it really hard to maintain optimum weight if you're using free fats in the diet. Where probably we have the most disagreement is around salt, because salt is an essential nutrient without which you die. So you have to have sodium in your diet. But just like you get enough carbohydrates from a whole plant food diet and you get enough essential fatty acids from a whole plant food diet, you also get enough sodium from a whole plant food diet. In fact, the American Cardiology Association says you need about 500 milligrams. Other people might argue you might need 1,000 milligrams. But whoever you decide to believe, there's no trouble getting that from a whole plant food diet. If you want to increase sodium intake because people are, say, athletes or they're sweating a lot or whatever, you can include some sodium-rich foods like celery or celery juice, tomatoes, chard. There's lots of foods that are naturally high in sodium without having to resort to adding salt to the diet. And adding salt to the diet does, as I said, it contributes to passive overeating. It can disrupt the gut microbiome. People that are salt sensitive, which is a significant part of the population, hold fluid in response to salt. Their blood pressure goes up. It's a major contributing cause of high blood pressure, which in turn is the leading contributing cause of death and disability. So getting salt out of the diet is very effective at improving a person's ability to lose weight and keep it off. Think about this, AJ. People overeat on foods like bread, and bread has 1,500 calories a pound. I'd say wheat berries, 500 calories a pound, bread, 1,500 calories a pound. And that's before you turn it into a butter boat and spread coagulated cow pus all over the bread, increasing caloric density even further. If you take bread and you remove the salt, oil, sugar, and yeast, you have something called matzah. And it's punishment on Passover. It's not something that, people tend to get as much trouble over. So it's not the wheat and the water per se that are the issue. They're being used as a carrier agent to drive sugar, oil, and salt to your diet. Think about another thing, something like beef. If you just took some beef and boiled it and asked people to gnaw on boiled beef, they wouldn't be that excited because, again, even meat is being used as a carrier agent to drive salt and sauces and different things to the palate. So if you remove the salt, you remove the stimulants, it becomes far less appealing. And also, the tendency to become overweight would be far less appealing.
Yeah. It's interesting. So if you look at the cover, it says, "Can fasting save your life?" It's like your is emphasized. It's in red.
Yes. Because one of the things about the book is it gives you the information you need to decide whether fasting is right for you. It's not right for everybody. It's not some kind of magic panacea that everybody just needs to fast and everything will be fine. It works really, really well for certain people that have certain types of conditions. And those are the people that typically have the conditions that are associated with dietary excess. So people that have dietary excess get fat, and part of that fat, around 10% on average, is visceral fat. And visceral fat is particularly a problem because it acts like a tumor. So, for example, if a person has 20 pounds of extra weight, they may have around 2 pounds of visceral fat. If you walked up to a person and said, "Look, you have a 2-pound tumor in your abdomen that's hypermetabolic, hyperplastic, it's producing inflammatory products, and it's causing health," they wouldn't be like shocked. If they had a 2-pound tumor, they'd realize that's a bad thing. But that's essentially what you have when you're overweight. So we need to stop treating overweight as an aesthetic problem and recognize it as a major health risk. Because it is, in fact, the visceral fat that produces the inflammation that leads to heart disease, cancer, diabetes, autoimmune disease. It's really interesting, isn't it, AJ, that all these different conditions, you have to actually go to different doctors to even diagnose and treat them. They're treated as if they're completely independent. When in reality, they all have one thing as a contributing cause, which is the visceral fat that produces inflammation that leads to the problem. That's not the only issue. Obviously, there's lots of different things that go on in people, genetically, environmentally, emotional stress, physical stress, physiological stress. There's lots of different things that contribute to a breakdown in health. But one of the common contributing factors to all of these leading causes of death and disability is carrying too much weight. Think about COVID. We had this recent pandemic. one of the major risk factors for dying from COVID was obesity. People, the more obese they were, the more visceral fat they had, the higher their risk of dying from COVID or, frankly, any infectious disease. And yet we didn't tell people the truth about that. We didn't see public health announcements saying, oh, it's time to really lose the extra weight and make us less vulnerable. In fact, I think what happened during that pandemic is people just got bigger and bigger. And as a consequence, we became more and more vulnerable to that, difficult problem.
Yeah. So are there certain conditions that are not amenable to fasting whatsoever?
Well, there are some conditions that really are less responsive to fasting in general. Neurological conditions, for example, although there may be an inflammatory component in neurological conditions that does respond. In general, those conditions would be less responsive than conditions that weren't primarily neurological. The genetic defects, where you have inherent problems, again, to be less responsive than conditions of dietary excess. These conditions of dietary excess used to be known as the diseases of kings, because it was the wealthy elite kings that could eat the highly processed foods and excess animal foods that lead to them. So not everything responds to fasting, but the things that do respond to fasting often respond very well. And we've laid that out in this book. What's neat about this book, too, I think, is that much of the content of the book is based on our own original research, where we've actually done the studies that are used as a basis of the explanation. I think that's rather novel. Most people that are writing books today, particularly in health, are relying on other people's research, whereas we've been fortunate enough at the TrueNorth Health Center to be able to actually conduct the studies ourselves.
Can you expound a little bit on the studies you conducted and how they were conducted?
Right. So we've done some clinical trials. The first thing we did, which was done with our colleague Colin Campbell from Cornell University, this was done actually 20 years ago, is we did a study on medically supervised water-only fasting in the treatment of high blood pressure. And we chose high blood pressure. Actually, we decided, Dr. Morano and I decided we were going to do that when we were going to school in Australia, before we even started the TrueNorth Health Center. This is like 40 years ago. And we did that because we kept seeing these people with high blood pressure get well. And, typically blood pressure is not a condition that doctors expect patients to recover from. In fact, they tell them, if you have high blood pressure, you'll be given medications. And these medications will have side effects like chronic cough, fatigue, impotence, and even death. But you'll be on those medications for the rest of your life, because your doctor will promise you, if you do what you're told, you'll never get well. You'll be sick forever. And that's what my uncle, who was a medical doctor, believed, because when I called him and told him that the patients with blood pressure were getting better, he said, no, they're not. And I said, yes, they are. And he said, no, they're not. And I said, I'm taking their blood pressure. He says, then you don't know how to take blood pressure, because he's been in practice for 50 years and they never get well. So I thought, well, we'll show him. So we came back to the United States and we opened the TrueNorth Health Center. This was 1984. And we began to very carefully monitor blood pressure. It was very common. And we got the right equipment and we started using standardized techniques and we tried to follow the protocols. And we started collecting large numbers of patients with high blood pressure. And what we were finding is they kept getting better. And so finally, we decided it was time to try to put a study together. But, if you've never done that before, it's pretty complicated. Fortunately, one of our patients was a guy named Colin Campbell from Cornell, who at that time had already published 250 papers in the scientific literature. So he was very experienced, full professor at Cornell University. And he came in and he said, look, he'll help us put our paper together properly so it can get published in the peer-reviewed journals. And so with Dr. Campbell's help, we managed to publish this paper. It went through a number of rejections from some of the medical journals who thought it was just insane, that you would do fasting with people. They thought, risks would be high and that, mortality would be high. But nonetheless, we did manage to get this paper published. Now, my uncle, he wouldn't help at all. He wouldn't even look at it. He said he wouldn't waste his time with that kind of nonsense. Unless it was published in a peer-reviewed journal, then he would look at it. And so anyway, we finally get the thing accepted. 2 months before it comes out, my uncle has a massive heart attack and dies. My mother swore he died just so he wouldn't have to admit he was wrong. But I think he died because of the Kugel and the Kreplach and the Blintzes and but we're never going to know for sure. But nonetheless, we got the paper. That was our first paper published. The second one happened a lot quicker. That was a paper on borderline hypertension, medically supervised water-only fasting in borderline hypertension. These are people who are at risk because of their elevated pressure, but the risk isn't quite high enough to justify medications. Until the blood pressure goes up high enough, more people would die taking the medication than would be benefited from the medication, so they don't recommend it. That's why they don't just put the meds in the public water supply, because they want to wait until the risk is so high of stroke that the slight bit of benefit you get from your medication reduces the stroke risk more than the increased risk of dying from the medications. And in that study, we found the same thing. The first study, we did 174 consecutive patients with high blood pressure, and 174 people lowered their pressure enough to eliminate medication. In the second study, we had 68 people that underwent fasting, and their fast ranged from 5 to 40 days. And again, all of these people normalized their blood pressure, and the majority of them got their pressure actually well below 120/80. And then we had a little bit of a lull, because those were papers that were done with Colin Campbell and Dr. Doug LIsle and myself. But then finally, we managed to hire Dr. Myers, who was a PhD postdoc from Columbia who had extensive experience in science. And she came in, and the very first paper she helped us publish was a case report. And it was on a young woman with follicular lymphoma, which is a type of lymph cancer. And she'd had this cancer progressing for a couple of years. She was assured by her oncologist that diet didn't matter, that she could eat whatever she wanted, and that fasting was criminal quackery. She came in, underwent fasting for 21 days, her tumors disappeared. We followed her up. At a year, we managed to put together a case report. It appeared in the British Medical Journal. We followed it 3 years later with a follow-up where it showed that she continued to be cancer-free. Now, I have to say, she was highly compliant. She followed a whole plant food, SOS-free diet. In fact, I warned her that if she didn't follow the diet, it could be fatal, because I'd track her down and kill her. And she believed me. So she followed the diet. 3 years later, cancer-free. And I'm happy to say, AJ, that we recently saw her on a 10-year follow-up and got whole body CT, and she's completely cancer-free. She continues to do well. And she's talked about her experience publicly and really influenced a lot of people. And as a consequence, we've seen a couple dozen more patients with lymphoma that have come to the center. And I'm happy to say that our case series that we put together has been accepted for publication. It will be appearing in a peer-reviewed journal, we believe, next month. And we hope that that's going to form the basis to do a clinical trial. We'd like to actually do a random assignment to condition trial with a large number of lymphoma patients and compare what's better, keeping people sick or getting them better, incorporating fasting and diet versus the standard medical care. And so all of this information in detail has been provided in the book, as well as other studies we've done on body composition, where we used a DEXA scanner to look at really what happens to the body during fasting. What happens, when you go on a fast, for example, you lose a bunch of weight, but some of that weight is water, some of it's protein, fiber, glycogen, and fat. But what we discovered is that the majority of weight that's lost is actually fat, and particularly visceral fat. And so a person that, say, fasts 2 weeks and loses 10% of their body weight doesn't lose 10% of their fat. They'll lose 20% of their total fat and maybe 40% of their visceral fat. And then what's even more interesting is that 6-week follow-up, the weight that's regained after fasting is water, fiber, glycogen, and protein, but not fat. The fat continues to come off. And so at 6 weeks post-fasting in this study, the percentage of the body that was made up of lean mass was actually higher than at baseline, but the fat loss continued. And so, I think that's a really important objective documentation, because in the past, people said, well, you gain weight, you lose weight, it's all the same, it doesn't matter. No, you're actually reconstituting the proportion of your body that is made of lean tissue versus made of fat. And particularly, it's effective at getting rid of the visceral fat that acts like a tumor, that causes the inflammation that leads to the heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and autoimmune disease in the first place.
Well, why aren't doctors in general and oncologists in particular excited about this?
Well, they don't know about it. It's not been released yet, AJ. It comes out on the 25th. And what I'm hoping is that patients will read it and like it, and they will give it to their doctor. So now their doctor will understand they're not actually a nut case, and the doctor will have enough information that they can guide them through a fast should that become necessary. We actually have a pretty active telemedicine practice now where our doctors work with patients remotely in conjunction with their local doctor and are able to do fast. Now, not everybody's a candidate for that. Some people have complications, they're on medications, they have issues that require them to be fasted inpatient, but there are some people that can do particularly shorter term fasts successfully on their own. But remember, if you're going to fast, you always have to follow the same protocol, whether you're at the TrueNorth Health Center or you're doing it with your doctor at home. History, make sure you're a good candidate for fasting. Examine lab, have baseline data, make sure that we have something to compare back to. You have to rest when you fast so that you burn fat, not protein. And you have to carefully recover after the fast with proper refeeding. It takes about half the length of the fast to recover. And you start off with juices and fruits and vegetables. And that whole protocol is laid out really clearly in the Can Fasting Save Your Life book. So people have all the information they need, what testing needs to be done. It has information so your doctor can interpret the testing properly. It has the dietary program layouts that can make sure it's done safely and effectively. So if you're going to fast and you do it properly, history, exam, lab, and monitoring, it doesn't matter where you fast, assuming you're a good candidate for that. And if you're not, we can bring you to TrueNorth Health Center and fast you in a more controlled setting.
So this book has the foreword written by Dr. T. Colin Campbell. You mentioned you've done some research with him. Why is he so interested in fasting?
Well, I think because he's the real thing when it comes to scientists, and he came to us, well, like 30 years or so ago. I mean, it was a long time ago. And he was, as he talked about publicly, was the first person to isolate dioxin, the active agent, Agent Orange. And he developed some very serious problems and decided to come to us and do fasting to try to deal with those problems. And fortunately for us and the world, fasting was very effective. And he talks about this in the introduction of his book, what his experience with fasting and with the TrueNorth Health Center was. And so anyway, he got well, and while he was there recovering, he got interested in our work and then went on to help us publish our first paper. So he was just instrumental in helping us from the very beginning. He also helped us critically go through all the information we were providing, educational information, helped us get rid of stuff that maybe wasn't as supported by the scientific literature and really focus in on the stuff that we could build a case for, and helped us identify what questions needed to be asked so we knew where to direct our research efforts. So I really, Dr. Campbell is truly one of my heroes, and he has been just tremendously supportive and helpful from the very beginning. And I was felt very fortunate that he was willing to write that forward to the book, which I found really compelling. He talked about his own experience and his wife's experience with us.
How long did he fast for? Do you remember?
Well, he's had several fasts over the years. And he, like I, believe that, fasting can be useful in treating people that have specific problems, but it can also be a useful tool in just kind of keeping things fine-tuned. And what's interesting is that not everybody has to do a very long fast, 30, 40 days, in order to get a big impact. Many people, even they're doing shorter fasts, oftentimes have very substantial benefits. And particularly for a person that's otherwise eating healthy and living healthily, they typically don't have to do as long a fast in order to get the results as a person maybe that's coming in off standard American diets and large numbers of medications, et cetera.
So if somebody reads this book, will that give them the knowledge and information to fast safely at home, or should all fasts be medically supervised?
Well, it would give them and their doctor information, but they do need the benefit of their local doctor because, first of all, you want to make sure a person doesn't have medical contraindications, and you do that with history and exam. And you need to have baseline lab data so you have something to compare back to so you can tell the difference between a healing crisis, which may feel bad but is actually good, or something that actually is bad. And so by monitoring electrolytes and monitoring liver and kidney function, you can ensure that you fast long enough but not too long. So you need a doctor to help you both getting those tests and interpreting that. Now, we do offer a service at the TrueNorth Health Center. If a person goes on our website at truenorthhealth.com, completes the registration forms, I'll do a phone conversation with them at no cost to give them an idea, one, are they a decent candidate for fasting, and help match them with an appropriate doctor that can support them, either through our telemedicine practice or the TrueNorth Health Center, or potentially some of the other people now that are starting to get involved in in providing fasting support. So there is a role of a physician, because a person, for example, that if you don't review the medical history, there may be contraindications to fasting. If you don't review the lab, there may be serious contraindications to fasting, and you wouldn't have enough information to reliably guide a person through the rather intense symptoms that can sometimes come up in fasting. The other thing about fasting is people sometimes are too active in fasting. So if you're going to fast, you're not going to work, you're not driving places, you're not doing that stuff. And when you come off the fast, you have to refeed carefully, or you can get refeeding syndrome or get post-fasting edema or get into problems. And so that's really one of the problems, that a lot of people don't necessarily have the discipline to go through a careful refeeding program. So they'd be better served coming to a place like the TrueNorth Health Center where it's done for them.
So are there certain conditions under which a person should never fast? Like, for example, type 1 diabetes.
Right. If you're a type 1 diabetic, for example, you wouldn't produce enough insulin to get into the fasting state safely. And so type 1 diabetics would become acidotic, and that would be a real problem. And so that would be a relative contraindication. In fact, we go through in the book all of the different conditions and signs and symptoms that would be, raise the flag of concern about fasting. And so you definitely want to read that section of the book, make sure that none of those things are relevant. And also, even as you get into the fast, new symptoms can arise. So it's important to be able to interpret those symptoms accurately. One of the challenges that many people and many doctors, unfortunately, don't have any experience with people actually getting well. As I said, if you're on blood pressure, the doctor knows you'll never get well. You'll be on drugs for the rest of your life. So when somebody starts getting well, they're not used to the presentation of a patient that's actually in a healing mode. So it's good to work with a doctor that's actually had the benefit of seeing people actually get well. Most people are just managing these symptoms with drugs. They're not actually helping people get to the actual causes of disease. They're treating the leading causes of death, not the actual causes of disease. They're not treating the reason people get the leading cause of death. And that's unfortunately a completely different set of skills and experience.
The patients that overcame lymphoma, do they ever do interviews? Because I think people would really like to hear from the people that have overcome such serious diseases.
Yeah, I think there's an interview on our website with our first lymphoma patient, and she's been willing to do that. We don't ask patients to expose themselves. She happened to volunteer, and she's very compelling. And now that it's 10 years and she's completely cancer-free, even her oncologist is like, now being more friendly and supportive of the radical diet and lifestyle changes. Because honestly, for many doctors, our patients are the only ones they've ever seen get well.
How important is the refeeding process, and what can you take us through a fast? Because I know you always encourage patients to get on the diet before they come, and I've heard you jokingly say that some get well just from the diet and don't.
I know, it's so annoying. I know they work with our doctors over the telemedicine before they even get there, they're already better. But that's what can you do? So that's acceptable. But some people, despite their best diet and lifestyle efforts, still have challenges that we need to overcome, or maybe they're having trouble making the diet and lifestyle changes sufficiently. And so putting them in a controlled environment can help get them through the hardest part, which is, the part where you get well. So diet preparation for fasting makes a huge difference. If you want to have a relatively pleasant experience rather than an intense and miserable one, good dietary preparation is good. And that means eating exclusively fruits, vegetables, both steamed and starchy vegetables for 2 or 3 days before fasting. If people do that before they get to the center, we can get to work more quickly. That means no coffee, alcohol, animal products. Basically, if you ask people just to eliminate anything that gives them any sense of joy or comfort, that's what we want to get rid of. And then, so then they do the fast. The fast will range from 5 to 40 days, depending on what their reserves are, what the condition is. And then it's going to take half the length of the fast to recover. So let's say they do a 20-day fast. They're going to have 10 days of program refeeding. There'll be 1 day of fresh fruit and vegetable juices for every week of fasting, 1 day of fresh fruit and vegetables for every day of fasting. And then slowly we'll be able to gradually add in steamed and starchy vegetables until by the end of half the length of the fast, we're back to a whole plant food SOS-free diet. If you try to speed that up, you can get a person quite ill. And, we learned that in the World War II when people came out of the concentration camps and had been going through starvation, and then they tried to realign them very quickly. And they got some people really ill. If we do this properly, we've done 25,000 patients so far. We haven't had any refeeding syndrome.
That's amazing. How long have you actually followed the diet that you advocate?
Well, I got really diligently applying it around 16. I remember at my 16th birthday, um, I was explaining to the family that I was vegan. I know my mom brought my uncle, the one that was so confident that blood pressure never could get well, to my birthday party, and he said that when my mom was concerned because I'd adopted a vegan diet, and he said, "Don't worry," to my mom, "these kids all go through phases." And he said, as long as I ate plenty of gefilte fish, I'd be okay. And I explained to my uncle that no, it's no gefilte fish, it's vegan, no animal foods at all. He said it's called being a mashugana, and you'll stop it right this instant. And he was very mad. And that was the same night I told him I was going to go into alternative medicine. I was going to do research on fasting. And he said, "No, you're not." He said, "Nobody in our family goes to a doctor like that. Better, let alone become a doctor like that." And he said, "Better I should be a communist spy." And my dad afterwards took me aside. He said, "Son, you know, your uncle is a very prominent physician, and he doesn't think much of this alternative medicine business." And he says, "Anything that makes him that angry and mad, it can't be bad. So you stick to your guns, and good luck to you." And my dad became a big supporter. In fact, he was developing very serious problems when I first started practice. He was having TIAs, and he came in and fasted. He did 26 days fasting. He had a fabulous outcome. 20 years later, he helped edit The Pleasure Trap. So he had gone from being in real trouble to being a big believer and a big supporter.
So you mentioned The Pleasure Trap, which is the first book, well, one of the first books you wrote. You also wrote a cookbook co-written with Dr. Doug Lisle, who's a frequent guest on this channel over 20 years ago. Is there anything in this book that's not in this book?
Well, it's completely different books. You know, this book is written, Dr. Lisle is the principal author of The Pleasure Trap. He goes through the whole history of, you know, health and healing and why, and the psychology of why it's so difficult to make diet and lifestyle changes consistent with health. And then it has a section in the back of The Pleasure Trap that overviews some material on fasting. The Can Fasting Save Your Life book, the principal author is Tasha Myers, who's a brilliant research scientist. And we combined her research science and excellent writing skills with my clinical experience, and the entire book is about fasting. So it's bringing our 40 years of experience and the culmination of the over 20 research papers and case reports into a book that covers in really technical detail, but in everyday language, I think a comprehensive understanding of fasting. It's really, I think, the most comprehensive review of fasting that's been done to date. And I attribute that largely to the fact that Tasha Myers is brilliant, and she's done a really thorough review of not just our own research, but everybody else's published papers on fasting. And she's one of those people that reads it, integrates it, and then can translate it. And I think that's really what this book is.
So when did you get interested in fasting, either for yourself as a tool or for something to help patients? Because you didn't change your diet originally by fasting. I think you read Herbert Shelton's book.
Yeah, I read Herbert Shelton's book, and it said that health was the result of healthful living. So that was diet, sleep, exercise. And he said that fasting was a useful tool at making up for the consequences when people hadn't been living healthy. And, you know, all of this really was about, honestly, beating Dr. Lisle in basketball. That was really, we went to school together. This is like fourth grade. He's like kicking my butt. We get into junior high, he's still kicking my butt. I'm looking desperately for some edge. And I thought, well, if I got healthier, maybe I could beat him. And I read the book and I started the diet. And of course, it completely failed, AJ, because he adopted the same diet. Here we are, we're 65 years old. He still kicks my butt every time we play. It's really very disappointing. But it did get me interested in all of this. So even though I couldn't beat him in basketball, I was able to at least get interested and found a very rewarding career. But, you know, when you deal with kids on the spectrum, sometimes they get interested in dinosaurs or spiders or carnivorous plants. I happen to get interested in this idea that health had causes and that the causes were diet and fasting. And so honestly, I'm 65. That was, you know, from a very young age, that my whole adult life has been really doing nothing but trying to investigate and implement this diet and fasting business, try to figure out how to do it better, how to make it work, and how to document it so that we could prove that this, in fact, is an accurate way of not just trying to help people live to their full potential, but avoid the debility that comes at the end of life. Everybody lives, everybody dies. It's inevitable. And as I said before, how long you live is largely genetics and luck. But how well you live is largely diet and lifestyle. So if you want to live well in whatever time you have left, the best advice I have is adopt a whole plant food SOS-free diet, get regular exercise, and try to get enough rest. And also try to minimize stress. You know, this constant stress people are under, probably not a very good thing for our immune system. And one of the things I've been suggesting to people recently is try to focus on only things you can do something about. Don't spend your time worrying about all the awful things that are going on in the world that you have no control over. Try to focus on things you might have some kind of influence on and let the other stuff go.
Dr. Goldhamer, in your book, The Pleasure Trap, you talk about escaping the pleasure trap. It sounds to me that you've been doing this so long that you never had to escape it, that you never succumbed to it in the first place.
Well, I was fortunate, yeah, because we were young and we were interested in athletics in terms of basketball. So I mean, I never had a drink or smoked a cigarette or drank a cup of coffee or used a drug or, you know, and I've been vegan for, you know, most of my life now. So it's a lot easier if you don't have bad habits to break. You know, nobody ever has trouble kicking heroin if they never use heroin. Nobody has trouble kicking alcohol if they don't drink alcohol. Nobody has trouble quitting smoking if you don't smoke. So it's been certainly a lot easier for me. I also work at a place called the TrueNorth Health Center, where we have a, you know, fabulous crew of chefs and access to wonderful organically grown food. So there's not the work that, you know, most people have to put in just to get access to healthy eating. You know, for us, it's much easier because it's there and it doesn't take all of the extra time and energy. So I think it's easier for me than it would be for most people. Also, I made a really, really good decision 40 years ago when I pursued Dr. Jennifer Morano and somehow managed to convince her to marry me. And what's even better is for 40 years, she's renewed my marriage contract 1 year at a time. And this last year, I thought, you know, we've been married 40 years. I'm going to ask her for a 2-year extension. But she said, no, just 1 year at a time. So I'm still on a year-to-year basis. But nonetheless, 40 years in a row, I feel like I've done an amazingly good job to be able to convince her to stay married to me for this long.
You're funny. Dr. Goldhamer, this chapter says that fasting reverses obesity. Is that a fair statement, that it really reverses it?
It does reverse obesity. You'll preferentially mobilize fat and particularly visceral fat. The problem is, unless you're willing to adopt a whole plant food diet, you're going to get your weight back because the things that cause the weight doesn't go away when you're fasting. Just the fat goes away. The causes, the diet and lifestyle issues, have to be implemented. And so that's why we do so much time educating patients. We call it educating. It's really brainwashing. But anyway, we try to do a lot of work educating people so that when they go home, they understand what they have to do, because it's hard. People live in a world designed to make them fat, sick, and miserable. And everybody wants to give them what they want, not what they need. And what they want is to indulge in short-term pleasure-seeking, self-indulgent behavior in the pleasure trap and not pay the price for it. And what they need, in my opinion, is to learn to escape the pleasure trap and adopt a whole plant food SOS-free diet, exercise, and sleep program so they can be healthy and hopefully have an increased potential for happiness.
Thank you. Do you want to take a few questions from the viewing audience?
I'd love to take questions.
Thank you. So watching live on Instagram is Sonia, who asks, does fasting deplete your microbiome?
It does. In fact, that's one of the big benefits of fasting, apparently, is when you go on a fast, there's a huge die-off in the microbiome. Microbiome are all the organisms that live in your gut. In fact, the average person has around 1 trillion or more creatures living in their gut. These are bacteria, protozoa. These are living, breathing creatures that are swimming around inside your intestinal tract, eating and drinking and defecating inside you right now. And what they poo in you varies on what you feed them. If you feed them meat, for example, eggs, dairy products, you'll have completely different organisms than people that are on a plant-based diet. People on a plant-based diet have 1,000 different strain of organisms balancing each other out. And instead of pooing TMA, which is trimethylamine oxidase, which you get from meat eating, which causes cancer and heart disease and whatnot, you get fertilizer, which is like vitamin K. So what you shove in your mouth determines what organisms live in your gut and what those organisms poo in you. So if you want fertilizer instead of toxic weight, shove in vegetable cellulose rich whole plant foods, and leave the meat, fish, fowl, eggs, and dairy products for the other people. And then after fasting, after you've had this big die-off, if you use the right prebiotics, that is the right diet, this vegetable-rich cellulose, you will grow back the normal 1,000 strain of plant-based organisms and start fertilizing yourself instead of poisoning yourself.
Thank you. And on YouTube, we have a question from Christina who wants to know, how do you keep from losing muscle mass when fasting?
Resting is the key. If you're too active, then the extra glucose that's required by your extra activity can only come from gluconeogenesis, which is a breakdown of protein. But if you're resting, you reduce your glucose needs to a very, very small amount, just a little bit of trace that's left using in the brain, and you're able to conserve your muscles and burn fat. That's why a person that loses 20% of their total fat would only lose 6% of their lean tissue. And that 6% of lean tissue loss will be replenished by 6 weeks of post-fasting. So during the refeeding period, you regain the muscle fiber, glycogen, and protein, but not the fat.
Great, thank you. And there's a question from Lucia. Is there such a thing as losing too much weight when undergoing a water-only fast?
Yes, that's why we carefully monitor people. For example, we don't fast people whose BMI drops below around 16. And we get more careful as it goes below 18. So we don't want to have people depleted. There's a process. If you keep fasting too long, you enter a process called starvation, and then you die. And so we don't do starvation at TrueNorth Health Center because it would be very, very bad for our outcome data. And so we're very careful to keep people in the fasting state. And we know how to do that well because we've had 25,000 people do that. And so far, all 25,000 people that walked in walked out.
Nice. Card Date says, if a disabled person can't exercise, can they still maximize health and maybe live longer eating a whole food plant-based SOS-free diet?
Yes, but most disabled people can exercise. You just have to modify the exercise to meet their need. There's all kinds of chair exercises and things that people can do. And even if a person really can't even do that, they can still maintain a high degree of health with diet and lifestyle change. It's really interesting. Weight loss, for example, is minimally affected by exercise. Exercise is really important for your overall health, but you can't exercise fat away. You have to control diet in order to control fat. That's the largest percentage of the effect size. And so even a person that can't exercise, that yes, they're going to be compromised by their disability, but not limited from being able to maintain a higher degree of health if they're willing to control their diet.
Thanks. Okay. Diane says, during an extended fast, is light exercise okay, like walking?
You have to limit your exercise. We do allow minimal amounts of activity. You don't want it to be completely limited in bed because you're vulnerable to the pathology of bed rest then, and you can develop pneumonia and have problems. But we limit, there's not going to be any aerobic activities. There's going to be maybe gentle walking on the grounds. We have Tai Chi now that we offer, and some yoga, some meditation, very gentle, not activities that are going to get your heart rate beating, not activities that are likely to increase your need to break down muscle tissue. So gentle, passive activity. And like, for example, even Tai Chi, we have one class for fasting people, one class different for people that are eating, so a different level of intensity.
Thanks. Struth would like to know, is someone with bipolar allowed to fast?
Yes, many of these neuropsychiatric conditions will respond. However, you don't fast on water only on medications. And so we'd have to stabilize a person off their medications and then do a fast and then hope that we got enough improvement that the need for medication could be reduced or eliminated. And for people that have this, you might want to read Anatomy of an Epidemic, which is an interesting book, which talks about the realities of neuropsychiatric meds, particularly serotonin uptake inhibitors, and what the limitations are and why it's so difficult to wean those meds, because once your D2 receptors in your brain are damaged and you try to withdraw the meds, at first you'll get acute anxiety and depression. So it has to be done very slowly and very carefully. This would not be something people should be doing at home or on their own. They should be doing it with experienced doctors that understand how to manage these very complicated situations.
Right.
However, a person that does want to improve their health, what they can do on their own is aggressively apply the dietary principles. And, they will still, if they're a female, they're still going to lose about 2 pounds a week. If they're a male, about 3 pounds a week. There are some people in our societies that have a lot more trouble losing weight. We call those people women. And because women are energy conserving fat storage devices that have lots of estrogen on board, which is a fat storage hormone. And so women have harder time losing weight. They have to work harder than the men do. Doesn't mean that they can't do it. It's just, it definitely takes more effort.
Yep. So Tammy wants to know if there's an audio book for this current book or for the Pleasure Trap.
There is an excellent audio book for the Pleasure Trap, and it was recorded by Chef AJ, who did a fabulous job in making that. And there will be an audio version. I don't believe it's available yet, but there will be an audio version coming out, hopefully in the coming weeks, for Can Fasting Save Your Life? But if you haven't read The Pleasure Trap, or even if you had, but you process information better in writing, you want to listen to AJ. She did a great job on a great book.
Thank you. It was an honor. And it was so funny how I always had to call you guys for pronunciation of very long words. That was a lot of fun. Amira said, I don't have a doctor or medical insurance. I'm a senior on a budget. I would like to try fasting on my own. I have asthma and I've been vegan for 12 and a half years, but you don't recommend people fasting on their own, right, Dr.
Well, I
Gold?
do recommend that they fast on their own every single day for up to 16 hours, which they can do without modifying their medication. But if they have asthma and on medication, they have a doctor. Somebody's writing that prescription. So if they want to do a fast in conjunction with their local doctor, our remote doctors can work with them and their doctor at helping them get through a fast safely and effectively. Certainly, I'll first determine if they're a candidate for fasting and then figure out how they could do it. Or if not a water fast, maybe a modified fast or restricted feeding program. But again, if they're on medications, we know they have a doctor because somebody's writing that prescription. So we want to approach that. If that doctor isn't appropriate for them, then we might be able to help them find a doctor. You know, now there's a lot of doctors like the lifestyle medicine doctors all over the country that are much more open to nutritional medicine management. In fact, I'll be speaking to that group in September in Los Angeles, all about fasting. And so I think that it is possible to find doctors now that don't think you're a whack job just because you want to eat healthy. Now, granted, there are doctors that think anybody that's concerned about their diet should be diagnosed with orthorexia, which is a new neuropsychiatric condition, which means you're overly concerned about your health, like, you know, vegans or gluten-free or people that have food sensitivities. They will just label all those people as orthorexic. Now, what's interesting is there's not yet a drug for that, but I bet you pretty soon they'll come up with a medication to treat this new neuropsychiatric diagnosis.
Thank you. And Lisa on Instagram says, well, how do you get electrolytes during an extended water fast if you're promoting an SOS-free diet?
Right. So on an SOS-free diet, it just means no added salt, oil, and sugar. You're still getting sodium from your food. You're still getting carbohydrates from your diet, and you're still getting essential fatty acids from your diet. And if you go into a fast with adequate reserves, in fasting, there's tremendous recycling that takes place. That's why a person that, say, went on water only might live longer than a person that just ate white bread only. The person eating white bread would develop vitamin deficiencies. The person that's going on the fast will not, because of the recycling effect that occurs in fasting. So as long as you're fasting within your reserves, you're going to do fine. If you try to fast too long, or if you have too active during fasting, or you have excess diarrhea or vomiting or something, you might deplete electrolytes, which is why we monitor electrolytes as well as kidney and liver function very carefully during fasting. Then if the electrolytes get a little low, we have a protocol that's laid out in the book, and then the protocol that you follow to make sure that that's addressed. Usually we don't add salt, but we'll use vegetable broth or other materials and move the person out of the fast so before they get into trouble. That's why those parameters in the book are so useful, because it gives doctors the normal sodium might, for example, be 135. Normal fasting sodium might be 130. But if it goes below that, then the doctor would know, okay, here's what the protocol has to be, so that we don't end up having to use IVs and deal with dehydration issues.
Thanks. Dakota is wondering, you're not overweight, so do you fast? How long and how often?
Well, typically what we want is everybody that's not overweight to fast every day for 12 to 16 hours. And then once a year, depending on how they do with the fast, it might be 5 days or a week, something relatively short. If they're stable at a week, then you're done and we move back to healthy eating. If they're symptomatic, we might need them to extend it until whatever the problem is resolved. The difficulty, AJ, is when you have truly healthy people, they don't need a very long fast to get a big benefit. But many people that think they're healthy turn out they're not, and you find that out when you put them on a fast. A lot of people think they're healthy until they look at their lab work, and then they find out, well, actually, they have problems with kidney or liver function. They got lipid issues. There's problems with glucose. They have inflammatory markers. A lot of people that think they're healthy because they're not overwhelmingly symptomatic or they're managing their symptoms with drugs don't realize they're actually in the early phases of breaking their body down, and which is why they're going to be vulnerable to spending the last 20 years of their life unable to talk or move, lying in some nursing home bed waiting for people to come and change their diaper.
Oy, that's quite a visual. Dr. Goldhamer, people are asking about certain conditions if fasting will help. So for example, I'm seeing MS, brain tumor, and menopause.
So menopause is a condition that, interestingly enough, often responds dramatically well to fasting and dietary change. There's an active estrogen hormone, estradiol, that's supposed to convert to estriol and excrete in the urine, but when the estradiol builds up, people get a lot of symptoms. Not to mention like fibrocystic breast disease, dysmenorrhea, menorrhagia, and people get some other problems with hot flashes, different stuff. Well, that process of normalizing the hormone seems to be benefited by fasting because of the alterations in the gut microbiome, I think, and also detoxification in general. So menopause, the disturbing menopause symptoms are improved with diet and fasting. In fact, it's very interesting, AJ, many of our patients that have been on this diet for a while, by the time they go into menopause, they realize it's really not that big of an issue. They don't have the debilitating symptoms that many of their colleagues on dairy products and whatnot do. So we like those kind of hormone-mediated problems, and we think the gut microbiome change is a part of the resolution. What were the other two?
So it was menopause, MS, and brain tumor.
So multiple sclerosis is a condition, a neurological condition, a demyelinating condition where the sheath of the nerve is altered. We don't know exactly why, that happens in people. I can tell you clinically that many of the patients that we see with MS, it doesn't necessarily cure their MS, but you do notice that those patients 5 years, 10 years later, oftentimes are not progressing. And so what we're hoping is that it's because the diet and lifestyle change is slowing down the progression. The problem is you don't know with certainty unless you have a very large population, because it goes at different rates in different people. So it doesn't necessarily mean that what we're doing is responsible. It may just be we're consistently lucky and we are only getting exposed to people that happen to have slowly moving MS and happen to do well. Maybe all the other people that go rapidly, we're just not getting a chance to see. Or more likely, as Dr. Schwank showed in his work, if you eat a healthy diet, MS tends to progress at a much slower rate than it does in people that are on an unhealthy diet. And brain tumors, unfortunately, aren't something that we've seen much results with fasting. A primary neurological tumor in the brain, really tough, maybe because the blood-brain barrier limits some of the activity that the body uses to kind of heal up. Other types of tumors like lymphoma that respond well. So I haven't really seen very much reduction in mass in brain tumors. And so it's not something that we tend to be treating routinely.
Thank you. Suzanne on Instagram is wondering why you recommend an 8-hour feeding window.
Well, what I recommend is between an 8 and 12-hour feeding window. What we want people to do is not eat 3 to 4 hours before they go to bed at night, so that they have better quality sleep, that they burn the food they eat rather than store it as fat, and that they have much less disruption. So by not eating 3 to 4 hours before you go to bed, that by definition means you're going to have around a 12-hour fast every day. And some people, if they're trying to lose weight, we'll have them delay breakfast until they do some exercise in the morning, and that'll preferentially burn fat and seems to help with some of the overeating. A lot of the eating that's done at night is not eating because people are hungry, because they just had a big dinner. It's because they're bored, they're fatigued, they're angry, and if they eat, they feel better. So they misattribute it as being hungry, when in reality, they're bored, fatigued, and angry. And so what I would say is, instead of if you're tired, go to sleep. Don't eat and then feel better because you're stimulated. If you're angry, make the other person eat the crap. Why should you suffer because they made you mad? And if you're bored, do something productive. Don't just sit and stimulate yourself with concentrated calories. You don't need that.
Thank you. So there's a question about prolonged fasting mimicking diet. It seems like it's very high in fat and sodium to me, says Jay.
It is, because it's macadamia nuts and vitamin supplement, basically. So, but what they're basically saying is, look, if you just take Prolon and don't eat for 5 days a month, you'll get calories and nutrients, and you can do that without getting into the problems of water fasting, where you have to be supervised and all that. And if you're not eating crap 5 days a month, you're just taking the Prolon powders, which is a little package. It's really easy to use. That's 15% of the time that you stop eating crap. And that's enough of a change to start making some improvement. They don't recommend dietary change the rest of the time. They're basically saying, do the Prolon for 5 days, eat your normal diet the rest of the time. It's very appealing because people don't want to be told, what are you going to tell them? Go on a whole plant food, SOS-free diet. That would like you to eliminate most people right there. But if you say, yeah, you can eat whatever you want the other days, but just do the Prolon 5 days a month, that's enough change that they can demonstrate some improvements. So I don't think you want to look at what's in the Prolon as the primary benefit. It's what's not there. What's not there is meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, and stuff. And that convenient, fast food, easy compliant program is enough for some people to kind of get started moving in the right direction. And I have to say, Walter Longo, who originated this idea, has published a tremendous amount of material in the peer-reviewed literature, not the least of which is his great article in Journal of Metabolism in 2015. And then he wrote a great book on fasting. And in the book on fasting, he said, don't ever do long-term water fasting because it's too dangerous. But he did have one exception. He said, unless you do it at the TrueNorth Health Center, because he was aware of our safety data. And I often say that, I evaluate other scientists' intelligence based on how much they agree with me. So that comment in that book made Walter Longo a genius.
Somebody's asking what the book you mentioned, Anatomy of an Epidemic by Robert Whitaker.
Yeah, very good book. Very disturbing book, though. If you read it, it will be disturbing to you because you'll realize, number one, they know exactly what they're doing with these medications. They know exactly what they're doing when they say you'll need to be on these the rest of your life. And they know that the original claim that it was a serotonin and dopamine deficiency problem that they were correcting with the drug is absolutely false. And they also know that there is a dependence that has occurred, which I think is seen as a positive benefit, so that once you start taking them, you have to take them forever.
Yeah. There's another book you sell at the TrueNorth Health Center that intrigued me. I haven't read it yet. It's called Emperor of All Maladies.
Yeah, Mukherjee's book on the history of cancer. And it's very interesting because it talks a lot about why the conventional treatment for cancer doesn't work. I mean, we kind of know that there's serious limitations, but he goes into great detail explaining why it doesn't work. And I find it's been very empowering for patients that are reluctant to undergo especially chemotherapy, radiation, in situations where there's really not much evidence that they're going to live longer or better if they do it, but it can have serious side effects. And he's not an alternative health guy. He's not your diet advocate guy. In fact, he has one line in his book on diet, and he says, we just don't know anything about diet. We don't know how it works or what's going on there. But he does trace in detail cancer treatment, and particularly when you read about breast cancer treatment and, how we used to treat women and the claims that were made and how ridiculous, many of those claims were, and how everything's kind of evolved where, they found that doing really radical stuff didn't work better than doing more moderate stuff, and that moderate stuff didn't work better than doing very gentle stuff, and doing nothing oftentimes works as well as doing anything. And so, and coming from a, top of the pecking order, Harvard oncologist, kind of guy, I think is a very good book. And other people must have liked it too, because he got the Pulitzer Prize.
Wow. I'm going to get it. I'm going to get it on Audible because it's about time I read.
Oh, you would love it, AJ, because he really goes through the whole history. It's very, reading it reminded me of Dr. LIsle because it's very detailed. He really gets into the nitty gritty and builds a very compelling case for his argument.
Yeah, I look forward to that being one of my next books on Audible. Linda says, is it normal to get nauseous and throw up during a fast? I was doing a 72-hour fast, and on day 2, I threw up. It was like pure acid coming out. I had to stop the fast at 48 hours. I have been vegan.
Okay, so it's very common, particularly in people that don't lead into a fast properly or done right. You can dump bile, and those are yellow-green pigments that are caustic and irritating. If they reflux into the stomach, you will experience some vomiting. What we typically do is we try to minimize it by getting people to prep properly for the fast. And then if we do notice too much in the way of vomiting or nausea, we'll go and move on to broth or juices, just like it's described in the book. And then once you stabilize a person after a couple of days, you can often go back to fasting without it being a big problem.
Yeah, I have a friend, I guess I shouldn't say her name, but she's my friend, and she says she's going to come to do a broth fast. Now, I've heard of juice fasts and water fasts, but I didn't know there was such a thing as a broth fast.
Well, broth fast is no calories to speak of. It's just you get some electrolytes. And for people that have trouble maintaining electrolyte balance, sometimes we have to introduce some of our vegetable broth. In fact, we're even getting a special therapeutic fasting broth that's dehydrated, that's made up. Well, your world is coming out with a line. It'll be carrot, celery, and let's see, carrot, celery, and kale. And that'll be dehydrated so people can reconstitute a fasting broth very easily at home rather than have to do what we do where we're cooking everything down fresh. So that's a product that's going to be available soon for people that are doing this remote thing, because it's very useful sometimes if electrolytes get to be an issue. AJ, does it matter that you're frozen right now on the screen?
No, it doesn't matter as long as you can hear me, because you're frozen for me too.
Oh,
And now you're unfrozen. So yeah.
okay.
As long as you can hear me, I think we're okay. Guys, am I frozen? Is Dr. Goldhamer frozen? Who's frozen? Let us know. I'm using an Ethernet connection, so I'm not sure, but we'll keep going even though we're frozen because they can hear us. But we can wind up soon, Dr. Goldhamer, because I have some good news. You're coming back on Wednesday, July 10th at 11 a.m. to answer more questions. And
Oh, that's great.
Yep, absolutely. Now you're unfrozen, but I think you're right. I think I am frozen. There's a
Okay.
question from Latif. What about underweight people? Will fasting damage their health? And can fasting be done if you don't have the desire to lose weight?
Yes, in fact, sometimes in order to get people to gain weight, we'll do a very short fast just to kind of reboot the gut microbiome and then try to build a person up. We always try to build them up first, before, but sometimes they've got disruptions in their digestive function. And so although it seems counterintuitive, sometimes a very short fast in a thin person can be very helpful at helping them ultimately regain lean tissue.
Great. And Infinite Love and Gratitude would like to know, can fasting at TrueNorth help with toxic mold exposures such as leaky gut and recurrent skin fungal infections?
Yes, we find that gut leakage is a major contributing cause to a number of conditions, diabetes and other conditions as well. And some of these chronic toxicity problems can be very tricky to treat, but we have had some very gratifying results. It's interesting, chronic Lyme disease, COVID, vaccine injury, and long COVID also are conditions we're now finally publishing papers on. We've got some good 2-year follow-ups in our long COVID patients, so we've got some papers that have been accepted for publication. All of that stuff is summarized in our book, Can Fasting Save Your Life? All of our research is available. If you go to our website, you can get access to all of our articles. We also have a Roku channel, TrueNorth Health. We have live streaming that we do that you can access freely through our website. So we have a lot of educational materials for people that they can access freely through our system. And if they can just read Can Fasting Save Your Life, I think they'll find they have a lot of the information that anybody would want to know about how to make fasting make sense.
Randy says that we're both defrosted when I asked if we were frozen. Apparently they can see you, but only hear me, and that is completely fine. Okay, so people are asking if Angela says, can fasting help with spinal issues like bulging discs?
So fasting as a component in treatment. With bulging discs, sometimes the problem is the inflammation around the disc, and you just need to use fasting to reduce the inflammation. Other times we'll do flexion distraction or physical therapy to kind of get more blood flow into the area so it heals a little faster. So yeah, fasting can be a component, but oftentimes we are going to be doing some physical therapy and ultimately core muscle strengthening so that the problem doesn't recur.
Thank you. Ginger says, why do you lose your hair after fasting? And it will come back because I want to do it again. Will I keep losing my hair every time I water fast?
Not necessarily, but anytime a person goes through rapid weight loss, whether it's dietary change or fasting, there's a nutritional shock that occurs and the body stops putting energy into growing the hair. So the hair will you don't actually lose your hair follicles. It's just the hair comes out together and then it recovers. Now, that can definitely happen with fasting, with weight loss, or with pregnancy. There's other kinds of hair loss in alopecia, and there's thyroid hormones. So, I mean, you want to check to make sure there's not something else going on. But if it's happening 30 days post-fasting or 30 days post-rapid weight loss, usually that's all that's happening, is that there's a transient, temporary period where the hair comes out together, so it looks like you're losing a lot, and then it tends to grow back.
Thanks. People are asking if water fasting can help with benign cysts, Wallstrom syndrome, and osteoporosis. Arthritis, oh no, osteoporosis.
Well, those are some big questions, and the answer is yes, no, and yes. In other words, there's some of the things, like for example, osteoporosis is a problem. For example, a vitamin D deficiency will contribute to osteoporosis. Hormonal imbalances can be a contributing factor to osteoporosis. Lack of weight-bearing exercise, animal protein diets, high animal protein diets. So those are all components. Fasting can affect some things, but not other things. So I don't know that we would, we wouldn't know what the actual cause of the imbalance is. So, I think maybe on the 10th, we can go into more detail. I can, discuss those things that are a little bit beyond a simple answer today.
Thank you. Dina says that every time she loses weight, she loses bone, even though she's working out. Is there any way to avoid that?
Yeah, I think if overall, like when we looked at fasting, there was no change in bone density, even though there was significant weight loss. So my suspicion is that the methods people are using to lose weight may not necessarily be the same whole plant food diet that we're talking about, because we shouldn't be getting bone mass loss if we're doing that healthily. But if people go on the dead Dr. Atkins diet, may his full soul rest in peace, high protein, high fat diets, then I can definitely see where they might have some vulnerability to, leaching taking place.
Thank you. Marcia would like to know if fasting can help with binge eating and if one can do remote fasting.
Well, people that have an eating disorder, a binge eating disorder, if they're going to use fasting, it's usually a very brief period of fasting just to reboot. It can be a trigger, so you want to be really careful, and I don't recommend you do that on your own. I think that's something that needs to be done in a controlled setting. And you'd want to work specifically with a doctor that's familiar with binge eating disorder. And we have a doctor on our staff. Her name is Dr. Chilla Varas. She's a woman naturopath and has a lot of experience guiding people. And it's not always fasting that she's recommending. It's oftentimes a diet and lifestyle modification to help deal with the issue. But having said that, we have had significant benefits in appropriately selected patients with eating disorders that have used fasting as a part of an overall program to bring these conditions under control.
Great, thank you. All right. What will Dr. Goldhamer prepare or eat on the plane when he goes to the NHA conference?
I won't be eating on the plane. I find if I fast when I'm traveling on a plane, I do a lot better. And the food that's available on the plane isn't normally food that would necessarily be health promoting. I will sometimes take, if it's a very long flight, I will take some stuff with me. And I find food that travels well, that's very satiating, and that they'll let you take on a plane, even things like a baked yam or potato, cold, it can be very delicious, very sustaining, and they won't take it away from you, as if when it's not a liquid and stuff.
A couple of people are asking about fasting with a hiatal hernia and if that would help.
Yeah, it does. A hiatal hernia, there's two things we do. One is mechanical. We'll do actually some chiropractic work where we release the diaphragm, adjust the back, and kind of pull everything down, so to speak, get rid of some of the inflammation in the diet. And many of those patients get tremendous relief. And so I would, but fasting also is tremendously helpful at reducing inflammation. What I like to do is combine the two of them.
Nice. Well, how long do you want to go, Dr. Goldhamer? Oh, now your eyes are closed. Wow, he looks so nice. This is Dr. Goldhamer sleeping. I think he's frozen. Can you hear me, Dr. Goldhamer?
I can.
Oh my
God.
God.
I think maybe it's a sign, AJ, and maybe we should defer the questions to the 10th, since I'll be back and we can answer everybody's questions.
Absolutely. For a minute, you froze and your eyes were closed, and I thought, well, this is what you must look like when you're sleeping.
Oh, maybe. I don't know. We'd have to ask Jennifer. She's the only one that knows what I look like sleeping.
So if you can hold the book up, because apparently I'm frozen one more time, we'd like people to buy the book and buy it by Tuesday or this week before next Saturday, in the hopes that you could become a New York Times bestseller. You can get it anywhere fine books are sold, like Barnes & Noble, other small booksellers, Amazon. But if you want a signed copy, there are two ways to get it. You can buy it from the TrueNorth Health Center. I put the link below in the show notes. And you can come to the Live Your Best Life conference on Sunday, July 7th, and meet Dr. Goldhamer, Dr. Lisle in person and get all your books signed by them. And please come back on Wednesday, July 10th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. Send your questions in advance to help@chefaj.com. And by then, hopefully, Confessing Save Your Life be a New York Times bestseller. Thank you so much, Dr. Goldhamer.
Thank you, AJ, for getting the word out.
My pleasure. And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back tomorrow at 11 a.m. Pacific time from Shane Martin from Shane and Simple on his new book, Baking Vegan Bread at Home. We won't tell Dr. Goldhamer about it because we know how he feels about bread.